we've been in sort of quite a long journey, I think, since the high-level panel report. It was actually 18 months since it called for a data revolution. And at the time, it definitely stimulated an awful lot of interest in people, and already after sort of within a month or two, there were a lot of conversations and discussions about how to make a reality of the data revolution. Some of the groups that got together then, a few themes emerged. So the traditional sort of statistical community took a great interest in this, in particular work that had been going into trying to strengthen national statistical systems in developing countries. We're sort of keen in terms of how we could now cash into the new interest in the data revolution. The open data people were really keen about how now we can actually throw data out there, and really keen in terms of how you can use open data to hold governments to account, but also to empower citizens. And then there was the technological people who are sort of saying there are all these opportunities out there now for how we can use data. At the same time, there were sort of different people were sort of, I think, inspired by high-level panel report call for the idea that we should leave no one behind. So there have been people asking for a gender data revolution, where we get much more information about people by sex. There have been talks about disabilities, the sort of people who are normally invisible. It's really hard at household surveys to pick up with small samples in terms of who out there is suffering from disabilities and what could be done about them, what are their circumstances. Likewise, there's a group looking at help the aged in terms of what sort of information can we get on different groups. So there's an awful lot of sort of enthusiasm about the ideas, and to some extent I think in terms of this expert group report, a lot of those perspectives have been really sort of very successfully brought together. So I think it's a tribute to the people who produced this report that they've actually responded to these different interest groups in terms of what this all means. I think we're at an interesting juncture at the minute in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. And actually, if you go back 15 years, the world was actually at a similar juncture then. And at that time, when people were thinking about the Millennium Development Goals, there was equally a huge amount of interest in data and statistics, and we're going to set new goals, how we're going to measure them. Interestingly, in terms of some of these earlier discussions in the wake of the high-level panel report, I think in some discussions there's a certain ambivalence about whether or not we should put the Sustainable Development Goals at the centre of the discussions. And I think that was influenced in part by some sort of reflections in terms of what had been achieved through the Millennium Development Goals, and a desire to learn the lessons from that. There's sort of terrible acronyms in international development. So we now have the Independent Expert Advisory Group, the IEAG, but there's also an intra-agency expert group that drew lessons from the Millennium Development Goals. And I think it's some important lessons there for us. I mean, I think if you go back 15 years, I think there's a feeling that perhaps in terms of the enthusiasm 15 years ago, we haven't actually capitalized on the opportunities. We haven't made as much progress as we might have wanted to have done over the last 15 years. There was a lot of political interest at the time, but I think certainly in terms of the desire to build and strengthen statistical systems to generate the data that was needed, that proved to be quite a slow process. These are sort of often in countries fairly fragile institutions. It takes a long time to get data out. And the political interest, moved on to other things. So the opportunity to some extent was possibly lost. I think also there's an ambivalence about the Millennium Development Goals in terms of it wasn't necessarily a sort of a shared set of goals that people felt this is the things that matter most to people. So there wasn't necessarily an alignment between what mattered to people and governments and what these goals were saying. And therefore, because of that, there was a sort of concern that with these goals, in terms of measuring them, I think good progress was made in some areas, like moving forward statistics in education and in health. But in other areas, I think it was felt that the goals actually distorted priorities. So economic statistics took a back seat, and agriculture statistics, which in many countries are really important because so much economic activity is around agriculture, and yet there was a sort of huge loss of capacity in terms of generating those statistics. And to some extent, the Millennium Development Goals were sort of blamed for some of those things. I think, again, the interesting thing about this report is it actually puts the Sustainable Development Goals back in some ways center stage, that this is where the political opportunity exists. And I think some of the lessons have been learnt. There's been great political processes and consultations, so that the new goals, we hope, are better aligned with what countries want from themselves. It should be about what are the sort of key challenges facing the planet, what are the things that matter most to people, and how do we measure those? And And I think also, the expert group is now sort of tapping into some of the things that have changed a lot over the last 15 years. We are in a new world, and I think the technological opportunities are there, and I think very much the case that Robert has demonstrated, the data revolution is happening. It is out there, and therefore the potential to do much better this time is enormous. The other aspect, I think, why people were ambivalent about the goals, though, was that there was a mismatch in terms of leaving no one behind. The huge amount of detailed, disaggregated data that you need was completely at odds with the type of quality of data that we've got. If you've got a country that hasn't carried out a census for 35 years, how on earth do you start thinking about even doing household surveys if you don't know what the population is? If you're concerned about poverty in these countries and you sort of see, well, what are the statistics showing? Well, the country hasn't carried out a poverty survey for 10 years, and therefore the information we got is terribly out of date. So I think in the early discussions, the feeling was, well, how do we square this great mismatch? And the expert group, I think, is showing the way in terms of there are opportunities, and the opportunities in many ways are about bringing these three different constituencies together. The traditional statistics and the traditional methods continue to be highly relevant. I think for the next few years, household surveys are going to be really important in terms of how we measure progress against the new goals. But if we leave it to those traditional methods on their own, we're really going to be back to where we were 15 years ago, and it'll be really slow, it'll be really expensive, and we're not going to get the results that are needed. I think the expert group is showing that actually, if you start getting these technological opportunities and you start marrying up the data, then there are really fantastic opportunities. So it's really quite inspirational in terms of what the opportunities are that are out there. But it's about integrating data, it's about filling in the gaps, it's about targeting and being more efficient, and it's bringing together the perspectives of these three different constituents, the technology, the open data that's happening, the open data, throwing the data out so people can use it, and you can't tell what people will do. I really like the example in the report about in Mexico, a scheme to sort of subsidize farmers. They put the data out and people find, well, this wasn't going to the most needy farmers, this was going to other groups. And that wasn't necessarily deliberate, but when the data is there, you can see what's happening, and then you can actually change the actions. So, Robert's analogy of driving, I think, is a really, really good one in terms of finding new information and responding to that. Let me just reflect briefly, perhaps, to conclude in terms of the recommendations. The challenge now is, how do we actually move forward? And this is really a challenging agenda. How do we do better than we did 15 years ago? I think the first recommendation of the report on principles and standards is really, really important. And I think this can be done. I think there already is a fair amount of consensus about what are good principles in terms of statistics, but we need to throw that open. I think there are new challenges in terms of technical standards so data becomes interoperable. How do we get geospatial data in and marry that up with existing data to sort of enhance the power of the statistics that we've got? And the idea of moving towards a sort of global consensus on what those standards are, that seems doable, and it sounds really, really important as a way forward. But obviously that in itself will not be enough, because once you've got the principles and standards, then the challenge will be how do you make them happen? How do you get people to adhere to those standards, say, of open data and making the data available? In terms of innovation, I think the report and recommendation about a new network of networks of innovation is really important. That will need more thought in terms of what shape that takes. I particularly like the idea of an SDGs data lab. I think, again, using the SDGs, the opportunities, we need to measure these things. How do we measure them? How do we get technology in? Getting all the best experts from around the world focusing on this is really exciting opportunity. And, things can happen if we do this. Resources and capability, again, we need to do a lot of work in terms of building capability. And I think this is to do with learning from each other. I think if there's anything we know from data science, there's no person has all this expertise, but everybody, or lots of experts, have a corner of the information, and we really need to come together and pool our expertise, and it's that partnership working is really going to be the way forward. Data science is a team sport, that it's not statisticians who've got their sort of set of standards, it's not the data people and the technological people who got it. We've all really got to work together. I think the biggest challenge actually is in the heading in terms of governance and leadership. I think to make this happen is really, really challenging, and I think in terms of building institutions that are fit to respond to the challenges that are before us is a big challenge. I'd be interested in the expert group's views about how we can actually make that happen. Within DFID, we will be thinking about these things, but we certainly don't have the answers. And I think in terms of the leadership, I mean, statistics are very, very political. Everybody wants data if it shows a good story in terms of what you're doing. We like to be accountable, but only so much. And the challenges and pressures on people who produce this data, it does call for leadership. And I think that's probably what we need now in the new world more than anything else, is we need leaders who can respond to the expert group and the recommendations on it to find a way. But I think this is a really exciting time. I haven't talked about the risks in the report, but I think they are real. But the opportunities are there, and I think now is the time to take things forward. So thank you very much.